Alongside Martin Luther, the name of John Calvin stands at the forefront of the Protestant Reformation. Calvin had a remarkable significance for the Protestant Reformation. He wrote voluminously, he wrote commentaries on most, if not all, the books of the Bible. He wrote a number of seminal theological treatises. He wrote letters. We have 4,000 extant letters of Calvin, which seems a lot until you realize we have 14,000 extant letters of Heinrich Bullinger. And perhaps above all, we have the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which stands at the very heart of the Reformed faith and probably is the essential fruit of Calvin's ministry and has stood the test of time throughout the last 4.5, 5 or so centuries. So who was this John Calvin? Well, he was a Frenchman. He was born in the small town of Noyon, about 60 miles or so northeast of Paris in Picardy. His paternal grandfather was a barrel maker and boatman, and his mother's father was an innkeeper. But Calvin's father, Gerard, had improved his lot to become something of a successful lawyer, with a practice that brought him into the society of both the local gentry and the cathedral clergy. And the side benefit of that to John Calvin, was that he was thereby educated privately with the sons of the aristocratic de Montfort family, and was also to be given 1 or 2 chaplaincies in the cathedral, which would serve as university grants, enabling him to do further study. Now, Calvin's father planned a career for his son in the church, and that path would take him, first of all, through the University of Paris, and thereafter to other spheres of study. And the hope would be that after that, he would be dependent on the patronage of the de Montfort family. Calvin goes to study in Paris. But there was an episode, and we're not quite sure precisely what the episode was, that resulted in a profound rupture in relationships between Calvin's father and the cathedral clergy. And it meant that Calvin's father changed his plans for his son and decided that his prodigious son, because Calvin was considered even in those early days something of a young prodigy, that greatness would come to him in the law and not in the church. And so for the next 5 or 6 years, Calvin went to the University of Orleans, attaining some distinction in a study for which he really didn't have any great love. It was while at Orleans that he was given the nickname the accusative case, and there is some debate as to whether that was to highlight his preciseness in terms of grammar, or whether it highlighted his more accusatorial prosecution of an argument. But significantly, it's in the years at Orleans that Calvin comes into contact with humanism, and probably, although it's difficult to be certain about this, with the evangelical faith as well. During these days, mid-late 1520s, all over Europe, Greek was becoming a necessary study for men who wanted to take learning seriously. Printing presses were supplying cheap editions of the Greek and Latin classics. There were already, by the late 1520s, half a dozen editions of the Greek New Testament, and actually as many of the Hebrew Old Testament. There was a revolution in thinking and taste. In fact, Heinrich Bullinger described it as the divine art of printing. Calvin came under this humanist influence. He saw the increasing importance of becoming vitally acquainted with the learning of the past, the great Greek and Latin classics. He began to learn Greek. He was renowned as a brilliant Latinist, and his French prose, so a professor of French one told me, along with that of Pascal, actually lay at the heart of modern French, that their writings, Pascal and Calvin's, were so beautifully constructed that they made an indelible impression on the development of the French language. Calvin learned Greek. He began to learn Hebrew. He developed a taste for good writing. He read widely in the classics, adding to Plato and Aristotle that he already knew. And he began to make close friends with like-minded young men. He set to work editing and commenting on a Latin treatise by Seneca entitled De Clementia. This was his first literary publication, 1532. He was 22 years of age. But during the years of studying law, a more profound influence than that of the Renaissance had overtaken Calvin. By the mid-1520s, all of Europe was ablaze with the writings of Martin Luther. Calvin came across Lutherans, probably first in Paris, and then secondly in Orleans. Now, we don't know the time or the circumstances of Calvin's conversion to the evangelical faith. There's actually only one passage, significantly one passage. There is another little passage which I may touch on, but there's only one significant passage in all of the Corpus Reformatorum, the Opera Calvini, the works of Calvin, 59 volumes. There's only one paragraph where he speaks about his conversion. It's in the preface to his Latin commentary on the Psalms, which I think was published around 1547. And Calvin writes this: God drew me from obscure and lowly beginnings and conferred on me that most honourable office of herald and minister of the gospel. What happened first was that by an unexpected conversion, he tamed to teachableness a mind too stubborn for its years, for I was strongly devoted to the superstitions of the papacy, that nothing less could draw me from such depths of mire. And so this mere taste of true godliness, isn't that interesting? He speaks of the evangelical faith as having a taste for true godliness that I received set me on fire with such a desire to progress that I pursued the rest of my studies more coolly, though I did not give up on them altogether. Before a year had slipped by, anybody who longed for a purer doctrine kept on coming to learn from me, still a beginner and a raw recruit. He speaks of himself being mired in the superstitions of the papacy. but by a sudden conversion. Deus subegit. It's a phrase you should know. Deus subegit. God subdued me. So you ask Calvin, could you please give us your testimony? Deus subegit. And he sits down. Calvin became marked out as a Lutheran. Anyone who espoused the evangelical faith was considered a Lutheran. And when persecution arose in Paris, where he had returned to teach in one of the colleges, he was forced to enter into hiding. There was an incident in 1533 called the Placards, where a number of zealous but unwise evangelicals posted and disseminated tracts throughout the city, and some even found their way to the Queen's bedchamber, and that was considered, just horrific. And Nicholas Kopp, who was the rector of the University of Paris, was considered to be behind this, and he had to flee. He was an evangelical. I'll explain what that means in a moment. And Calvin was associated with Kopp. So Calvin has to leave, and thereafter he becomes something of a refugee. At first he seeks refuge in Basel. And it's in Basel that he publishes the book with which his name will always be associated, the Institutio Christianissimi Religionis, the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, the word institutes maybe doesn't convey very much to us. Perhaps better to translate the title, The Principles of the Christian Faith, or Instruction in the Christian Faith. And for Calvin, the aim of the institutes was to provide an elementary manual for readers who wanted to know something about the evangelical faith. He wrote it principally for his fellow countrymen. In the preface he speaks of his fellow countrymen, the French, who were like sheep without a shepherd. And he's seeking to provide a brief compendium of Christian truth to direct them and nourish them and ground them in the gospel. The first part of the title expresses the same, as he writes himself. The principles of the Christian faith, containing almost the whole sum of godliness and whatever it is necessary to know about saving doctrine. Calvin later wrote that he undertook the work, and this is what he wrote: all I had in mind was to hand on some elementary teaching by which anyone who had been touched by an interest in religion might be formed to true godliness. Now notice, just to true godliness, the aim is not just to bring people to a saving acknowledgement of Jesus Christ. It's to bring them to true godliness. I laboured at the task, especially for our own Frenchmen, for I saw that many were hungering and thirsting after Christ, and yet that only a very few had any real knowledge of him. The first 3 chapters of the Institutes of 1536 take up 81 pages. They form the heart of the book. Between the Roman Catholics and the Reformers, there were 3 major disagreements on the church, the sacraments, and justification. And Calvin seeks in the Institutes to address these 3 areas: the church, the sacraments, and justification. And in the final chapter, he packs in 3 other topics: Christian liberty, the authority of the church, and political government. The fact that the length of the last 3 chapters is double that of the first 3 indicates, I think, a second purpose of the book. So his main aim is to nurture and nourish in the faith poor Frenchmen hungering and thirsting after true godliness. But also, his aim is to make clear to non-evangelicals, whether Roman Catholics or Renaissance humanists, where the Reformation stood doctrinally. There were ideas current identifying the Reformers with various ancient heresies, with extreme anarchistic Anabaptists, with moral permissiveness. You know, it's the same in the New Testament. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Meganoito. By no means. People listened to Paul and they thought, well, he's just saying that we have license to sin. Well, Calvin's addressing some of these issues to try and help people see that the faith of the Reformation did not lead to moral license. With his brother and sister and 1 or 2 friends, Calvin decides to leave Basel and head for the free city of Strasbourg, where Martin Bucer had established a Reformation stronghold. But to get to Strasbourg, the little company had to make a significant detour. If you know your geography at all, I've got geography of Western Europe in my head, so it's in a sense easy enough for me. They had to go around 2 sides of a triangle into what we now call Switzerland, and then approach Strasbourg from the south and go straight up from Geneva. Because there were little wars, probably little more than large skirmishes going on. They get to Geneva, and Geneva, just a few short months before, had declared itself for the Reformation. And they put up at an inn for the night, intending to resume their journey in the morning. But before the evening was out, the leader of the Reformation cause in Geneva, Guillaume Farel, heard that the author of the Institutio was in the city. Now, Farel was beside himself. He was being overwhelmed with work. He was a Boanerges. He was passionate. He was zealous, but he lacked the gifts necessary to establish and root the work of the Reformation in Geneva. Organization was not his strong point, and he had few helpers. Now he hears that Ile Gallus, that Frenchman, Jean Cauvin, had come to Geneva. He hurries off to the inn, and he pleads with Calvin to stay and help him secure the cause of Reformation in Geneva. But Calvin was not having any of it. He says, I'm a poor, timid scholar. All I want to be is left to write and reflect. I'm not a pastor. I'm not an administrator. I'm heading for Strasbourg in the morning. Well, Farel was baffled, frustrated, and he cursed Calvin. Well, actually, what he said was, God curse you and all your studies if you abandon the cause of Christ in Geneva. Now, Calvin later wrote, I felt as if God from heaven had laid his mighty hand on me to stop me in my course. I was so terror-stricken that I did not continue my journey. That's the way to do it. Through all that followed from 1536 to his death in 1564, notwithstanding the near 3-year interlude, which we'll come to in Strasbourg, 1538, 1541, Calvin was persuaded that God had called him to this city. He stayed, but after 18 months or so, he was banished. And the reason he was banished with Farel was because they wanted the church to be the church. They wanted the church not to be under the state, but to live alongside in a coordinated relationship with the state. But for Calvin, that meant that the church alone must have the right of excommunication. Now, that was almost unheard of. Excommunication was not seen to be exclusively the right of the church. It wasn't in Bern, it wasn't in Zurich, it wasn't in Basel. But Calvin and Farel were adamant. And it came to a crisis, and the city council basically banished them and sent them packing. And Calvin, with relief, actually, heads off to Strasbourg. It seems that the Lord has rescued him from this lion's den. 1541, Geneva writes to Calvin, please return. Please return. Calvin initially resists. He wrote to Peter Martyr Vermigli, I would rather die 100 deaths than return to that hellhole of Geneva. I would rather die 100 deaths. So why does Calvin return? Why does he return then? Well, Deus subegit. God subdued me. He was not his own. You know Calvin's motto? Cor meum tibi offero Domine prompti et sincere. My heart I give to you, O Lord, promptly and sincerely. My heart, cor meum, I give to you, cor meum tibi offero, my heart I give to you, Domine, O Lord, promptly and sincerely, prompti et sincere, promptly and sincerely. Calvin's not his own. It's interesting that while in Strasbourg, Calvin marries the widow of an Anabaptist they'd both come to faith under Calvin's ministry. And Calvin's friends had been saying to him, you need to get a wife. Calvin says, no. So they set up a little marriage bureau. Nothing's new under the sun, So they find this very wealthy woman. And Calvin says, no, I can't marry someone who's got too much money. That would not be good for a poor pastor. Then they find another woman, seemingly very pleasant, but she didn't speak French very well. Calvin thought, no, I don't want that. Then they find a third woman, and Calvin agrees and says, yeah, this seems okay. But then, a short time before the wedding, Calvin gets cold feet, and he actually sends one of his friends to tell her that the wedding is off. Actually, there was another woman, but Calvin thought she was too ugly. It's just part of the humanity. But Calvin marries Idelette de Boer, and he loves Idelette dearly. Calvin doesn't demonstrate, he's not your typical, what you might call typical Frenchman. He's a kind of tightly buttoned up Frenchman, but when she dies, and she had 2 children who both die, Calvin is heartbroken. He speaks of her so warmly and movingly. But when in Strasbourg, Calvin not only becomes the closest of friends with Martin Bucer, who influences him significantly, but also with Philip Melanchthon. And it's in Strasbourg that Calvin publishes his first commentary. Now, guess what his first commentary was on the books of the Bible? What would almost be the last book you would think would be, if someone said to you, write a commentary on, what would be the last book you hope they would ask you to do? Romans. That's his first commentary. Romans. And it's in Strasbourg that he rewrites and begins to expand the institutes. Since 1536, Calvin has been reading more and more of the Church Fathers, and he realizes the institutes need developing. And he now puts it out, the second edition, 1541, with the unashamed claim of presenting a comprehensive statement, quote, of well nigh the whole sum of our wisdom worth calling true and solid wisdom. He wasn't backward at coming forward. This was not so much a revision as a rewriting, although much of the earlier material is incorporated in it. The 6 chapters now swell to 17. The Catechism form was abandoned in favour of a broader treatment, centering around the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. And eventually it's going to become to be patterned after the sections in the Apostles' Creed.